Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily for November 7th, 2017. On today's show, we're going to be talking about a bunch of news, including AMC's theatrical masking policy, the Justice League running time, Luke Skywalker's backstory in Star Wars: The Last Jedi, and Mark Millar's first Netflix project. And in the mailbag, we'll be talking about movies that deserve sequels. This is Peter Sciretta. And joining me once again on today's podcast is Slash Film weekend editor Brad Oman.
Hey, what's up, everybody?
You're back, kind of.
I'm back.
Not yet, but
yeah, just
you're
for
here.
today.
Yeah.
I'm here. I don't even know how long it's been since I've been on. It's been a while, though.
Yeah, last time you were on, you talked a little bit about your teaching. How's that been going?
Yeah, it's going fine so far. I'm just exhausted all the time. Really, it's just that's the big thing. It's just because going back and forth between the Slash Film stuff that I still do and the teaching and the stuff that I have to do for my actual student teaching program, it just leaves very little free time. And so, yeah, like I'm busy pretty much every part of the day. So very little breathing room for anything else.
Do you still get to go see movies?
Not nearly as often as I would be if I were doing my normal stuff for you guys. It's like in October, when I saw Blade Runner 2049, but that was the first movie I had seen in like 2.5 or 3 weeks. And then I missed another 2 weeks of movies basically until I saw, gosh, what did I even see? Oh, for October break, I saw like Battle of the Sexes and Kingsman, Golden Circle finally. And then I took another little bit off, and then I just saw Thor Ragnarok last week. So I'm trying to keep up, but...
Wow, MoviePass is almost breaking even with you.
Almost, but not quite.
We've talked, let's jump into the news. We've talked about in the past about AMC. I know that you're not a fan of AMC. On the site yesterday, we had this article on this tweet. Basically, the headline is, "The world's largest movie theater chain essentially admits to not caring about theatrical presentation." So what is this story about, Brad?
Yeah, so, I mean, and here's the thing, too. Let me just start by saying I don't completely and, like, blindly hate AMC Theaters. I think there's some good things about them. I think their Stubs program is awesome. Ever since they revamped their concessions, that's been pretty good. But when it comes to the actual presentation of movies, it seems like they've been caring less and less about delivering a quality theatrical experience. And that's exactly what this most recent update regarding them is about, because this moviegoer went to go see a movie, and while they were watching it, they noticed that there was no masking being done to this movie. Now, for those of you that don't know what masking is, just to give you like a brief explanation is, most movies are filmed in one of two different aspect ratios, which are referred to as full and scope. And in order to switch between the perspective and the size of those aspect ratios, masking is done to expand or shrink the borders of the screen so that the movie fills the entire screen, so that you don't see any letterbox bars like you do when you watch a widescreen movie or like a CinemaScope size movie on your widescreen TV at home. But apparently AMC Theaters now is starting to have this normal policy where they don't mask their movies, so you see these black bars above and below certain movies, and sometimes to the sides. So this is just now making the presentation of the movies look awful, because you have these dull gray bars that are just sitting around your movie, and it really takes you out of the experience. It makes you feel like you're watching a movie on your TV, even though you have this big screen in front of you. And they replied to a person who complained about it that this is just the normal thing that they're starting to do now, because apparently their digital lines are so clean and crisp that now it's just okay to do that. And it's really disappointing.
Yeah, and they said like the projection technology. I mean, some projection technology, like the laser projection technology of like Dolby Vision. The blacks are so black that they say you can hardly notice, but it's never going to get to the point of having an actual mask over the screen.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just, I don't know how much it costs to maintain the mechanism that, opens and closes to, create the masking effect. Maybe they were having to repair it too often and it was costing them too much money. I don't know, but either way, it seems like a pretty poor decision to make a worse theatrical experience. And this is coming from somebody who has had unpleasant experiences with how AMC Theaters treats their movie screens anyway. Like, for example, my local AMC theater, I went to see Get Out with my mom, and this was my second time seeing it, and I thought that the screen looked a little too tinted blue. And so I went to talk to them, and I was like, I think something's wrong with the color settings on the projector or something. And they were like, oh no, our screen is scratched. I go, and if the silver screen gets scratched, it creates some inconsistencies with the color. I'm like, okay, so why are you still showing movies on that screen? And then I saw 2 weeks later, I saw another movie in a different theater in the same multiplex, and it had a similar issue where it was a smaller section, like a faded circle in the middle of the screen where it was vaguely tinted blue as well, and it had the same problem. And just out of curiosity, I went and checked the other screen that had a problem with from 2 weeks earlier to see if it had been fixed yet, and it hadn't. And their excuse was that there's only like one company for the entire country that fixes silver screens, and they had to wait until they got to them. And I'm just like, give me a break. Like, if that's the case, you either need to get a rush and get them to fix this, or you need to stop showing movies on these screens because they look terrible.
Yeah, and I talked about in the past my experience going to see Blade Runner and showing up to the theater and the ticket taker telling me, oh, by the way, the sound is kind of broken in that IMAX theater that you paid $20-something to see the movie in. It might be a little echoey. If you want, you can get a refund or see the movie. And I was like, wait, who would choose to go see the movie to pay?
By the way, 50% of your movie theater experience is going to be bad. So if you want to pay for your ticket still, that's cool with us.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just the worst. And by the way, I've talked to some people that apparently, I've gone to Regal cinemas, and this is also a policy with theirs that they are not doing the masking anymore. So this isn't something just isolated to AMC. This could be the future of, these mainstream, widespread multiplexes. And it's a shame. I haven't experienced this in person, but I do remember going to see The Hateful Eight when it was doing its road show, and I saw it in AMC Theater in Burbank. And that I'm not sure if you saw the road show version of that Quentin Tarantino film, but it was a very weird, different aspect ratio than normal. I forget what it is, Cinescope or something.
Yeah,
and basically it was formatted on the screen that almost like that basically they didn't have their masking technology couldn't go to the edges of the thing, so there was wide air, like it was basically what this guy is saying. It was basically an unmasked very wide image in the middle of a screen, and it was very distracting actually. Have you had any experiences with not seeing masking in an AMC theater?
No, I haven't yet. Well, I did have one time, but it wasn't. They didn't do it on purpose. It just happened that their masking mechanism happened to be broken that day. It was actually when I saw Moana, and when that happened, it was really distracting for me because I complained about it. I was like, this isn't the movie, because it looks like the movie's not filling the whole screen, even though that's how it's supposed to be presented. And it's almost kind of like a psychological thing. Like you feel like you're being gypped because you're not seeing the movie fill the full, area of what you see in front of you. And it really bugged me, but they couldn't do anything about it because their mechanism was broken. And so, yeah, like I said, I imagine that's probably why they're pulling back on it, so they don't have to keep fixing it.
I've also noticed that, I'm not sure if you've noticed this, but some AMC theaters, when they show trailers, the trailer doesn't fill up the whole screen. Have you seen that?
I have seen that, and that's also annoying to me.
Yeah, it almost gives me like anxiety because I'm like sitting there watching the trailers and I'm like, is this messed up? Should I go and talk to someone? Like, is the movie going to be okay?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Next up in the news is Warner Brothers apparently made sure that the Justice League runtime was under 2 hours, so they mandated it. What do we know about this, Brad?
Yeah, so there's a new report from Wall Street Journal that did some, profiling of Justice League And apparently Warner Brothers CEO Kevin Tsujihara said that he specifically told Zack Snyder, Chris Terrio, that they wanted Justice League to be under 2 hours. And that's likely in reaction to the fact that Batman vs. Superman Dawn of Justice was a bit of an excessive 151 minutes, which was just a little too hefty of a movie, I think, for people to really enjoy. So they specifically set out to make what is essentially the shortest movie in the DC Extended Universe.
Now, a lot of people are celebrating this. They're celebrating that, like, studio mandated running time. Is that something we should be celebrating?
I mean, in this specific instance, I think yes, because as somebody who has enjoyed Zack Snyder before, I like 300. I like Watchmen. I think that he can definitely, and I think even people who love him will agree with this, be a little self-indulgent. And that includes runtimes for his movies. And Batman vs. Superman was no exception.
Although I would argue that I think the ultimate cut of Batman vs. Superman, have you seen that?
I haven't gotten around to watching it, but I have heard that it's better.
Yeah, it's better. I'm not going to say it's a good, it's a great film, but it does make it better. It's a much more coherent movie. And Zack Snyder has a career. I wrote about this in the past on the site. That has this career of, I think, great or better director cuts than the theatrical cuts. And they usually release the director cuts on Blu-ray or DVD. And, I'm wondering if Warner Brothers had their hands in trying to get Batman vs. Superman to a more manageable length, and that led to, the cut that we saw in theaters. Not that I suggest that the 3 hour or whatever it is ultimate cut should have been in theaters, but it was definitely a better experience. I don't know.
It's tough to say because, like, you don't want the studio meddling too much with the director's vision. You don't want to cut a runtime just for the sake of cutting the runtime. And I imagine that certainly a big part of the motivation for this was you can't play, a 2.5 hour movie as often as you can a 2 hour movie in theaters. And if Warner Brothers is at all worried about diminishing returns because of the, reaction to movies like Batman vs. Superman and Suicide Squad, which both did great at the box office, but also still ended up being panned by critics and even some fans, that you want to make sure that you get your money's worth with a movie like Justice League. Since this is Justice League, I don't really think they have anything to worry about because you bring all these superheroes together on the big screen for the first time, so it's a little bit different. But there are definitely some people who I think still have this bad taste in their mouth who, might wait to see whether or not Justice League will actually deliver what they hope it will before they go see it.
I mean, you do make a good point. Most of the money that a movie makes is that opening weekend or two. And, if you have a 2 hour movie, you can fit one more showtime per day in that theater. But it's also interesting if you look at, like, the movies that have made the most of all time, and you also look at the most critically reviewed movies of all time, there's shockingly more movies that are like 2.5, 3 hours than there are, like, 90 minutes, 2 hour movies. You look at the biggest movies of all time, like, Avatar, Titanic, those things, like, they're usually like these big long epics, right? So yeah, I don't think it's smart to limit yourself, but maybe it is smart after you've, had 2 movies with Zack Snyder and you're like, we know what we're going to get with this third movie. Let's give him, let's constrain him a little bit. Anyways, also in the news, Mark Hamill has been doing some interviews, and he basically told Disney Insider, he spoke about the biggest challenge he faced returning to his iconic character for all these years. And this is the quote he gave. He said, the biggest challenge for me was actually in the time between Return of the Jedi and Star Wars The Force Awakens. I had to know what had happened to Luke during these years. I had to glean decades of backstory from the script, and some of it I had to make up for myself. I had to know what he went through during this time. It's not important to the storyline for this film talking about Last Jedi, but I did discuss some of my thoughts with writer-director Rian Johnson to make sure I wasn't coming up with anything in my personal backstory that would affect Luke's portrayal in this film. So I think this is interesting because he basically says here that what happened to Luke Skywalker between episodes 6 and 7 are not very important to the plot of Star Wars Last Jedi. I know that's probably simplifying things. We have seen in the trailers that we will apparently see a flashback to that, that fateful day when Kylo Ren and the Knights of Ren kind of massacred the Jedi Academy that Luke Skywalker was a part of. We see Luke's hand reaching out of the rubble. So we're going to get to see some of what happens between Return of the Jedi and Force Awakens. But, also today we published the story of Kathleen Kennedy basically, trying to set fan expectations in an interview with StarWars.com. She basically said that, the movie won't answer all of the questions. It'll answer some of the questions. So, Brad, I guess what I'm asking is, should we be mad that they're not telling us about Luke Skywalker and what he's been up to? And I guess my concern is, are they just going to throw this into comic books and books that I'm going to have to read later on? I want to see it on the big screen. What about you?
I mean, no, it's a very good question. But at the same time, we have to think about the fact that there are plenty of answers to questions that we never really needed, but we got from the prequels, and it kind of ruined stuff for us.
Oh yeah, who is the Emperor? You hear all these people saying who is Snoke? Where did he come from? We didn't know anything about the Emperor, and then they answered that in the prequels.
Yeah, exactly. And we don't need all the answers to all of these questions. That's a big part of the reason why I'm worried about the Han Solo movie is I don't necessarily know that I need answers to all the signature traits of what makes Han Solo, and so. I think leaving some mystery is good. That we don't necessarily need to know everything that happened during that time span. I'm sure we'll get some of it filled out, but I feel like it's better to join characters at a new point in their story, in their journey, and pick up with them from there, and kind of put certain pieces together and make our own assumptions, and allow filmmakers to keep that mystery and leave it open for like our own imaginations. Like I think it's good for fans to be able to like think about things themselves and fill in the gaps their own way, so that we don't need every single detail for every single character. So while I would like to see some of that on the big screen in some way, I don't feel like we need everything explained to us.
And we should mention, I mentioned yesterday on a podcast that the whole Disney situation around the LA Times, that basically they had blacklisted the LA Times for writing articles about the Anaheim elections and their treatment of how they handled that or whatnot. That basically they didn't allow the LA Times to see press screenings for Thor Ragnarok. And in response to that, a lot of critic organizations stood up with the LA Times, including the one I'm a part of, Los Angeles Online, basically saying that they weren't going to include Disney in the awards, in their critic awards later this year, in unity with the LA Times. But that whole thing has come to an end. Disney apparently has seen, the error in their ways and have agreed to work with the LA Times going forward. So we've talked about Mark Millar's deal with Netflix. They have announced the first project that they're working on together. That is The Magic Order. Brad, what do we know?
Yeah, so Mark Millar's comic book company, Millar World, was picked up by Netflix a little while back. And initially, everyone, thought that this was mostly because they were going to start turning some of Millar's other comic book properties into, TV shows or original movies. But Netflix was actually looking to get into the publishing world as well. And they've just announced that their first comic will be The Magic Order, which sounds particularly cool. I'm going to read you the official synopsis of the series. We live in a world where we've never seen a monster, and these people are the reason we sleep safely in our beds. Magic meets the mob in the Magic Order, as 5 families of magicians sworn to protect our world for generations must battle an enemy who's picking them off one by one. By day, they live among us as our neighbors, friends, and co-workers, but by night, they are the sorcerers, magicians, and wizards that protect us from the forces of darkness, unless the darkness gets them first.
I mean, Mark Millar is always great with a premise. This sounds awesome.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly cool. It has, like a little bit of Harry Potter in it. It's got a little bit of Men in Black in it. It's got a little bit of, pick your mob movie. And, I love combining, these different genres and bringing them into one area. Hopefully it turns out to be something extremely cool, because this kind of idea doesn't always work out too well. Like, I'm not necessarily sure how Netflix's Bright is going to turn out, but like, I like the idea of mixing fantasy creatures and characters with a gritty crime underworld, but there's something that's kind of off about what we've seen in the trailer so far. But this, I hope it turns out to be something that is worth watching. Inevitably, when it turns into a series. For now, it's just going to be a comic book, but I'm already looking forward to when they decide to turn this into a series. But hopefully, the comic book is, on its own, something that's worth paying attention to.
This whole deal with Mark Millar is weird because, I think many people, when it was announced, didn't expect that Netflix was going into publishing comics. They thought, they were buying Miller World to, get those stories to turn them into TV programming and movie programming for their service. It's interesting that, this is their first comic book. I'm wondering if the idea is to test these ideas in the comic book world and adapting the ones that hit to, onto Netflix shows and movies. Like, what do you think the grand plan is for this?
You mean for Miller World in general, or for like their comic?
Netflix's use of Miller World. I can't imagine that Netflix is super interested in making money off comic books in this day and age, right?
No, but at the end of the day, if they own the rights to the comic book, they don't have to pay anybody for them, and they're in control of where the series goes if they turn it into a series, or where the movie goes if they turn it into a movie.
Oh, for sure.
And any money that is made from, whether it's merchandise or something like that, it all comes back to them because they own the rights to it. So I think that's probably their biggest game, is just being in control of every facet of the properties that they create, as opposed to some of the other projects where they've either, picked them up, they're the one distributing them, and other people still have their hand in it as far as ownership is concerned. But I'm just wondering, like, are all these projects going to be coming from Miller, or are some of these like ideas that Netflix has for TV shows that they're like unsure about, that they're like, let's turn this into a comic book for, $1 million or whatever it costs to make a comic book, release it, see if people grab onto it, and then, do you know what I mean? Using it as a backdoor pilot for movies and TV. No, for sure. This is something that, Hollywood is obviously afraid of original ideas. They need to have a proven entity, and for the last 10 years, I think at Comic-Con, you see a lot of like celebrities putting themselves in comic books and basically promoting comic books as like a backdoor to try to get a movie or TV show made. So we've seen a lot of that. None of that has kind of really taken off in the way. Wasn't there, before Oblivion was a movie, weren't they going to publish it as like a graphic novel just to like get some traction first, but then it ended up just moving forward as a movie instead? Yeah. I think they actually made a comic book that for the sole purpose of pitching it as a movie. I'm not even sure if the comic book ever was released. I don't think it was. But okay, so that does it for the news. Let's get into the mailbag, because we are running long, but we have a good mailbag question, so I want to get to it. Errol from Los Angeles writes in, what movies do you think should have had a sequel but never did? And if you have the time, what would the plot to that said sequel be? I'm not going to get into that much, but he has a idea for Brothers Bloom sequel, which I'm not going to get into the plot because it's kind of a spoiler. But I would watch that. Okay, so let's just get into our sequels that should have happened.
I'll start off first with Tron Legacy. It's a sequel that could still happen. I think that movie sets up a world and sets up characters, and Disney really wanted to have a sequel, and there might be a sequel. But I really love the aesthetic, the sound of that world. I want to spend some more time inside of Tron. I know Tron Legacy wasn't the best received movie of that year, but visually it's just so stunning, and I want to spend more in that world. Although I think the movie kind of sets up this. I'm trying to think of a way to say this without being spoilers. It kind of sets up the idea that the things inside the computer are going to come out into our real world, and I'm not sure that's that exciting. Like, I don't want to see people with like light discs throwing light discs in our real world. That doesn't seem exciting. I want to see more of the world inside the computer. How about you?
I'm pretty sure we're fine with spoilers for a movie from 2011.
People, you don't know, Brad. I get the emails. You have no idea.
Well, then you give them my email, and I'll just send them one single email back.
Okay, what is your first pick?
So my first pick, and it's going to sound ridiculous at first, because first of all, this movie is not good. But there was a time when I saw it, and I really liked it, because I was still kind of young and not educated in the ways of, good cinema yet. But Lost in Space from 1998.
Yeah, and that's based on a TV show, and it's going to be a TV show for Netflix, actually. They're making a TV show. Yeah,
it's supposed to make a comeback. But I loved that movie when it came out in 1998. I was 12 years old when it came out, so it was like a sweet spot for me. For whatever reason, I was so excited to see it, because I knew it was based on an old TV show, and I liked the concept. It looked really cool, and I loved that movie. And it is blatantly set up for a sequel. I won't say any spoilers, because just in case. But
for a movie that's what 30 years old.
Yeah, almost 20 years old.
20 years
but,
old.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But yeah, it is a very clear setup for a sequel where they could have done anything. And I've always wanted to see that happen, but now it's far too late now. But it would have been cool, I think, to see that story continue, even if the movie didn't particularly didn't age very well for me.
Yeah. Another one on my list is a movie that came out a few years ago called Dredd, starring Carl Urban as Judge Dredd. I think this movie, has a cult following now, but I don't think it was as well received as it is now. It's kind of like was at the time. I think people were saying it was kind of a Raid ripoff, which it is kind of a ripoff the Raid and set in a sci-fi future. But I want to see further adventures of Dredd, and I love what Carl Urban did with Dredd. I loved wasn't his sidekick Olivia Thirlby? She's great. She needs to be in more stuff. They've been talking about doing a TV show. I'd just like to see further adventures of Dredd. What's your next one, Brad?
My next one is District 9. Neil Blomkamp's fantastic 2009 sci-fi action adventure. And there were talks of District 10 becoming a thing at one point. We were introduced to the concept of District 10 at the end of District 9. That doesn't spoil anything. But we have yet to see it happen. And there's been talks of Neil Blomkamp, taking on another sequel in the Alien franchise, but that seems to have fallen apart. And so, there's no better time, I think, for him to dive back into the movie that kind of gave him the career he has today. And I would love to, spend more time in this very unique, grounded sci-fi world that he created. It was such a compelling movie. It was nominated for Best Picture. And so seeing a sequel to it, I think, would be fantastic. I'd love to see what he can do, back in the world that he crafted so meticulously.
Yeah, and he hasn't had a hit in a while. I would love to see, Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh come back, because I feel like, Blomkamp has some genius in him. I feel like he just needs a good producer to kind of manage it all.
Yeah.
Yeah. Next on my list, we talked a little bit last week about the possibility of a Goonies sequel. Sean Astin was talking about it. I'm not sure I'd be super excited about a Goonies sequel today, with the kids as adults and new kids. I'm not sure if that would be good, in kind of like the legacy equal thing. But I wish sequels were as big when in my childhood as they are now, because I would have loved to have seen, 2 years later after Goonies came out, a Goonies sequel with the same kids having a new adventure. I used to play that game for NES, which was a Goonies 2, and it was like a story of like some kind of mermaid or something. It didn't make any sense, but I still love wondering what that movie would be. But sadly, never get the Goonies sequel. What's next up for you, Brad?
Next up for me is Galaxy Quest. I don't know why we never got a sequel to this movie.
Well, you did, and it's called The Orville.
That's not fair, and that's not accurate, and that's not even no. Galaxy Quest is so cool, and it's another one of those movies that where it is very clearly set up for a sequel. You can follow the further adventures of the crew, but I don't think Galaxy Quest was like a runaway hit when it was released in theaters. Like it did well, but I believe it's gained in popularity more so in the time since it hit home video.
Yeah,
and it's a movie where you could still do a sequel today. It's unfortunate that we're missing Alan Rickman for sure. That's very sad. But the good news is that we'll be getting a sequel in some capacity, not in a theatrical sense, but the forthcoming TV series, as long as it moves forward at Amazon, is a sequel kind of story, because it will feature the old crew and it will also feature a new crew as well, following in the footsteps of like the Star Trek reboot style.
Yeah.
So we'll get a sequel in some way, but it won't necessarily be a big screen sequel like I had always hoped to see.
No, I want to see further adventures of Galaxy Quest, but I kind of wonder, like, is the appeal of that show doing kind of like a Star Trek parody, or is it, the fish out of water, having these people that were the actors in the show being thrust into the reality? And I feel like in the sequel you lose a little bit of that second component.
Yeah, you definitely lose it a little bit. But at the same time, I think that's why I'm still very excited about this series, because it throws in that idea of them still being fish out of water, because they're dealing with the fact that their show has been rebooted and they're no longer like the cool crew.
Yeah, no, it's a good idea. Next up on my list is another movie from my childhood, which I wish had spawned a sequel at that time, and that is Who Framed Roger Rabbit. That movie was, magic. It really was. And they tried to work on a Roger Rabbit sequel. I think J.J. Abrams even was involved at one point, like early in his career. But they never got a Roger Rabbit sequel off the ground. And I think that would have been great. I'm not sure it would be great today, but I would have loved to see. That movie was there's a lot of Hollywood is doing these mashups today, like the Avengers. They want to see like these characters interact that shouldn't interact, and Roger Rabbit was that before anything else, I think, kind of. And I don't know. I wish we had gotten a Roger Rabbit sequel. What's your next one?
My next one is, and this is something that was talked about in an edition of Slash Answers, is John Carter, the franchise that Disney hoped would be, but ended up being dead on arrival.
It definitely set up sequels.
Yes, it did, and there are so many books that Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote that allow for sequels to happen. But man, I really liked John Carter a lot, and I think that a lot of other people like you and me also enjoyed it. It had a Star Wars feel to it, mixed with Indiana Jones, and it was stylish. It was fun. I didn't necessarily dig Taylor Kitsch in the lead, and apparently a lot of people agreed. but I still really enjoyed the movie, and I wanted to see where the franchise would go. But unfortunately, it just, it bombed hard at the box office, and we never got to see it happen. I hope that they try again with John Carter at some point, because I think that there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah, you know what? The marketing campaign for that, I think, was just bad. Disney was afraid of, releasing a film set on Mars. They took, it was originally called John Carter of Mars, and they took of Mars out of the title because they wanted to sell it to, people that thought Taylor Kitsch was hot and didn't want to see a sci-fi movie. And, yes, I don't think it's a home run, but I would have liked to see more. And I think someday, somewhere, they're going to reboot that because it's just such a classic sci-fi story. Next up on my list is the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off. They've been talking about doing a sequel to that for many years. I think since John Hughes is dead, I don't think it's ever going to happen. But I think it would have been cool to see Ferris Bueller, in his 20s at an office job and kind of like trying to ditch the job for the day. I think you could have done something cool with that in like the 90s. Or like early 2000s. Today, with Matthew Broderick, obviously it wouldn't work. But I don't know. I think that could have been a cool way of doing a sequel to Ferris Bueller. What's next up on your list?
First of all, I just have to say that that's the only one that you have here that I vehemently disagree with.
Why?
Ferris Bueller's Day Off is a perfect teen high school comedy from the 80s. It does not need a sequel. I think a sequel would taint it. It would just be...
But you don't think they could have done for what it does for teenagers in high school, it could have done for 20s?
No, I think that there are already movies like that without being a Ferris Bueller sequel. Like, I think that a Ferris Bueller sequel would have been The Hangover Part 2.
Okay.
Like I just feel like that would have been it would have just been retreading all of the same beats, and there's no way. There's just no way.
I don't know. I think it would be interesting to see what happened to Ferris Bueller, but you're right. Maybe the way Hollywood would take it, especially without John Hughes, it might not be the right direction.
Yeah. So the next one on my list is Real Steel. This is a movie that I really, really liked a lot, and it's the kind of movie that Disney doesn't really make too much anymore. They've kind of strayed away from any live-action movies that aren't remakes of their animated movies in recent years. And so this one for me is directed by Sean Levy, and it's way better than a movie like this has any right to be. It's got an Amblin sort of feel to it. I've always really liked it. And, if boxing movies like Rocky and now Creed can get sequels, there's absolutely no reason that Real Steel can't get a sequel. I would love to see, how Adam, the robot boxer at the center of the story, evolves as a fighter. And I just think it would be great to continue that story.
Next up on my list is one of my favorite movies. It's Almost Famous. It's one of your favorite movies as well. I know this might be blasphemy putting this on this list, but it's, I just love the film so much, and I haven't seen Cameron Crowe do anything as personal since this movie. And I think if you know the story of Cameron Crowe, which is what, the story of Almost Famous is based on, I think you know where this could go. And, in his 20s, he's working for Rolling Stone magazine. Rolling Stone magazine moved from L.A. to New York. Cameron Crowe decided to stay behind in Los Angeles. And he... I think, he was doing freelance work for them, but, he kind of, now that he wasn't a teenager, it wasn't as a hut of a writer, and he kind of pitched this book to a book company that he was going to go undercover at a high school and for a year and write about it in a book, and that book became the book Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which got adapted into a movie. Now, he's not a character in that book and movie. I don't know. I think that would be an interesting, even if it wasn't a direct sequel, if it was a spiritual sequel, I think there could be something to that whole, a writer going undercover in high school and that whole thing. I think there's something there. It might not be Almost Famous too, but what do you think of this idea, Brad?
I think that Cameron Crowe's life is definitely an interesting one to turn into a story. I think you're right, though. It's probably not Almost Famous 2, but it's probably just, either some kind of series or a film that's kind of just about, again, loosely based on Cameron Crowe's early life, how he became a filmmaker and that kind of thing. There's definitely an interesting story to be told there.
What's the last one up for you?
Last one for mine is Spaceballs, without a doubt. I have always wanted to see a Spaceballs 2, and I'm kind of surprised that, one didn't happen after the prequels came out, since the prequels are just ripe for parody. And now that we have a whole new Star Wars trilogy and even more Star Wars films that are being made, I just feel like there's no better time for a Spaceballs sequel to come together. And there have been rumblings of it here and there in recent years about, it potentially happening and them trying to get it off the ground. But Mel Brooks is definitely getting up there in the year. So if it's going to happen, it's got to happen very, very soon. And I'm not sure I would trust anybody else besides Mel Brooks in his hands. Because the only person...
Did you ever see that really crappily animated TV show?
No, I never got to see it. I was always interested in seeing it just to see how bad it really was.
It was not good. So, yes, without Mel Brooks involved, I would not watch it.
The only person I think that I could trust with Spaceballs is probably David Wayne and Michael Showalter. Because...
What about Lord and Miller?
Well, here's the reason I say Wayne and Showalter is because They Came Together, which is an incredible parody of romantic comedies. It is in the same vein as Airplane and The Naked Gun. It's ruckusly hilarious. And so if anyone knows how to do parody the way that Mel Brooks and Abrahams and Zucker do, it's Wayne and Showalter. Like, they nailed it. And so if anyone could capture that same spirit and has this, kind of the nerdy sensibility to do it right, I think it's them. But yeah, and Rick Moranis' idea is the one that I've always wanted to see come to fruition. The pitch that he had for Mel Brooks was it was going to be called Spaceballs 3: The Search for Spaceballs 2.
I love that as a title. I'm not sure if that's an actual good movie, but
I think it would be awesome.
The last film on my list. By the way, this list was kind of hard to put together. It was hard to think of movies that I love that I actually want to see more of, and one of them that came to my mind was the Doug Liman 1996 film Swingers, starring Jon Favreau and Vince Vaughn. Obviously, those two have worked together again. Made is kind of like a spiritual sequel to Swingers, but, it's obviously them playing much different characters. I don't know. It would have been interesting. I think Hollywood has changed a lot since the mid-90s. I think it would be interesting to see, what happened to Mike and Trent and all those guys, where they ended up. And, obviously they're not going to capture the magic that was Swingers. It would probably be a disappointment, but I kind of want to know what happened, where they went after the events of that movie.
Oh, I have one more.
Oh, go for it.
I can't imagine it would be good. Probably wouldn't. But I have always wanted to see a Wayne's World 3. And I recently rewatched Wayne's World 2 because it's on Hulu. I mean, I have it on DVD, but it was just a little more convenient, and I saw it pop up on Hulu, so I just played it while I was working. And Wayne's World 2 it hits the same kind of beats and similar jokes as the first movie, but it's a solid comedy sequel. It works really well.
I think people don't like it because the storyline's a little too ridiculous.
Yeah, but it's based on a Saturday Night Live sketch, and the first one wasn't grounded in some serious reality or anything like that. It definitely heightens the comedy a little bit, but I still think it's really funny and extremely enjoyable. And just I think it would be fun to bring Mike Myers and Dana Carvey back together.
So is Wayne's World now a YouTube show?
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I think that's what's so cool about it, is so much has changed since the 90s that, in this case, bringing those characters in, seeing what they're like in this time frame would be extremely interesting. Whether it's because they haven't changed with the times or because, they have, and it's just, the same Wayne and Garth just living, in contemporary society. I think that would be interesting. And if they're going to make a Bill and Ted 3, then, why not make a Wayne's World 3?
I think you got the pitch there. It's that they haven't changed with the times, but they're, the clash of that.
Yeah.
But that does it for both of our lists. You can ask your questions to us in the mailbag by sending your emails to peter@slashfilm.com. Please mention your name and general geographic location in case we mention your question on the air. Brad, where can we find more of your work online?
I'm on Twitter at Ethan_Anderton. I'm also still writing at slashfilm.com, though not as frequently as I was a couple months ago. But don't worry, I'll be back in about a month and a half or so.
We have been warned.
Exactly. And then you can also listen to my podcast called Go Flix Yourself. It's available on iTunes and other podcasting platforms.
Yes, you can find all the stories we talked about today on slashfilm.com. There's actually a feature on today's on the site today, an unpopular opinion saying that Stranger Things 2 is better than Stranger Things 1. Blasphemy. But go read that. You can click on all the links in the show notes. You can find this podcast published every weekday on iTunes, Google Play, Overcast, all the popular podcast apps. Please send us feedback, peter@slashfilm.com. Please go to iTunes, give us a rating, give us a review, and we will see you tomorrow.